Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chasing Collectibles Catchup. I'm Tyler,
I'm Tim.
I'm Lauren.
and
I'm
with
Rick.
us today we have for our 17th episode. With our show is now officially old enough to see a rated R movie. We have Rick Frogge with us from the comicspriceguide.com. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming on with us.
Oh,
And
I appreciate it. Appreciate the invite.
we've spent when we first started talking. I mean, I think the first day when we talked on the phone, we talked for like an hour and a half just about potential things we could have talked about. So I mean, you have a wealth of knowledge, and we could honestly sit here for a long time. But we're going to try our best to keep this condensed this evening. And just want to start off. What got you into the comic book hobby originally?
It was really weird when I was a little kid. Um, Everybody, relatives, cousins, whatever, almost all were 3, 4, 5 years older or older. And we had, I had a cousin that we went over to his house a lot on Sunday. He was 5 years older than me. So the last thing he wanted to deal with when he was 13, 14 years old was an 8 or 9 year old kid. And he had this chest of drawers full of comic books from the early 60s. This would have been about 60, 67. And so he would just say, he'd open up the chest drawers and say, here, just read these. And then he'd go off with his friends. And it got to a point where I really fell in love with the art and the stories. And every weekend, actually, I looked forward to us going over there. And, my parents were kind of like, well, you're going to be bored. I'm like, no, I'm not, you know. And um, I just got into, I really enjoyed the stories. And back then, of course, stories were, most one issue things. So you read a comic book, you got the entire story, then you went on to the next. And that's what got me into it. By the time I was like 9, 10 years old, I was, I would get allowance or go sell bottles back in those days. You could take bottles to a grocery store and when my mom would go grocery shopping, there was a drugstore right next door, and I was kind of stupid because what I did was I bought my comics and went and sat at the soda fountain, ordered a cherry Coke, and read comics. I should have grabbed the ones I weren't going to buy and taken the ones home with me I bought, but it just grew from entertainment to became a hobby where I just I really loved it. Um, and by the time I was 13, 14 years old, I was ordering mail order because back then, there were very few stores in the country. There were shows were, very, very small, and we didn't have any in our area at the time.
So were
So
you growing up, were you more of a DC guy, Marvel, or were you kind of dipping in both?
really both. And again, it was my exposure through my cousin. So I was, he had FF and X-Men and Metal Men and Flash and some Superman and Batman. But it was so funny because as I got older, people would say, what were some of your early books? And I'd say Metal Men, and they'd go, who? But it was a different time. It was a totally different time. But I guess a little of both. You know.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting, like with them being sold in drugstores. There was like I can't remember what horror movie it was, but my wife and I saw a movie a couple years ago and it took place in the 70s. And they were at a pharmacy and you could see comic books in the background. I was like, yes, they did their research. I get, you know.
The only problem that I always see with movies or TV shows mostly is that they'll have something like that, and then the comics on the racks are like 3 or 4 or 5 years old or 10 years
But
old,
yeah.
where they don't actually put the right comics on the rack. But
It's too expensive. They
that's
don't have
just
that in their budget.
yeah, that's the other issue. It was
I
so funny
imagine.
because
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say the Tennessee State Museum one time was doing a thing about World War II, and they contacted us and they were like, we'd like to have some comic books in there, from World War II. Now, remember, obviously that's Golden Age comics, which are expensive, and for the most part, and they wanted superhero stuff, and they wanted the big ones. They wanted Batman, and they wanted, some Superman, and they somebody at the museum knew about Timely's Human Torch and all, Captain America. And then, I was like, well, I'm sure we could work something out. And they were like, well, great. How many are you willing to give us? And I was like, I'm sorry. The word give didn't work out very well.
I imagine back then with having the subscription part of it, did you have to deal with the old subscription creases, or did they arrive safe?
Well, as far as what I collected, when I was buying mail order, I was actually buying Golden Age mail order. There was a guy that advertised in comics back in the 60s and early 70s named Robert Bell, and he was in New York. And so I was getting my new stuff at the drugstore, and I was saving up money and buying Golden Age. I mean, you could buy a like an issue Superman Action Comics, mid 40s. You could buy them for $7-8 in fine condition.
Wow.
And plus a couple of bucks max for shipping. And back in those days, they would be like, and we'll take stamps. I never quite got that, but you could send them stamps for what you owed them.
Wow.
Yeah,
So personally, no, I never had to worry about the subscription creases because I never went through the Marvel or DC subscriptions.
Okay.
And that's exactly the reason why I didn't, was because I did know friends that had, and their books had shown up folded over.
Yeah.
Couldn't deal with it.
Well, I guess fast forwarding quite a bit, what was it like working for the Overstreet Price Guide? That must have been pretty cool.
It was definitely cool. I mean, no matter what, we have to kind of look at our hobby in general. And Bob was a huge part of starting this hobby and making it a national or getting national attention for it. I think the thing that you're talking to these older guys. Of course, I'm older now, but back then, in the 80s and 90s, I was dealing with guys that are my age now, and to them, Golden Age books were no big deal because they were raised with it. And I remember the first time going to Bob's house and seeing multiple copies of Action #1 and just going, what in the heck?
Wow.
But as far as working for the Price Guide itself, it was, a lot different back then because you didn't have the internet. Information was a little slow coming in. You had to depend on store owners and obviously show dealers and collectors to be able to get valid information. And that's an important part with any price guide, no matter whether it was back then or now, is that the person who's putting that information together and putting it out on a price guide has got to know the industry, because there are so many people that will try to influence you to change prices. And the one thing that needs to be, made known is that the price guides do not set the prices. The customers do. We can all day long sit here and tell you this book should sell for this, but if nobody buys it for that price, that's not what it's worth. And vice versa. If we tell you a book is worth $100 and everybody in the country is selling them for $200, then obviously we're wrong. But price guides do not. And I know people this day that they're just like, we're waiting to see what the price guide's going to price this book at. And it's like, the truth of the matter is that an accurate price guide reports what books are being sold for across the world. Now, you're going to have some areas of the country where one book sells for $100, the same book. Another part of the country may sell for 50, the same book in another part of the country may sell for 25. And in Europe, it may sell for double. So you kind of have to be able to look at it and figure out what's the cause and what's the reason. And I may have really gone off the Overstreet question, but it was really amazing back in those days when, you could meet the artists and writers. They weren't movie stars. I guess that's a tacky way to say it, but you would go to a convention and you could sit and talk to them for hours. And the hobby was exactly that. It was a hobby that we all enjoyed the same thing. I remember Jim Shooter saying one time that he remembered when he would go from Connecticut to New York on a train. He'd be open his briefcase and be looking at comics when he was an editor, and that people would kind of look at him like he was a weirdo. Here's this guy in a suit. If you've ever seen Jim, he's a big guy, and he's looking at comic books. Why would this adult be reading comic books? And then today, people look at you, and it's in a whole different light.
Mhm.
But Bob, I believe, really needs to be thanked for what he did for this industry and how he helped create it. Certainly, there were people collecting long before the Overstreet Price guide came out, but not to the level it is now.
Yeah.
So you're talking about what drives the value of books.
Right.
Can you give us a little bit more detail in, is there, because I know a lot of people, they talk about speculating, or they talk about you got these books that are hot for about a few months, and then they're back down to what they were,
Or worse.
Yeah.
I think that our hobby, that speculation has been a dangerous part of our hobby for decades. It's not new. You obviously, the internet has made all of this easier to obtain information. It's made it more famous. It's given people a bigger voice, so to speak. But what you've got in some instances is you have, what's the reasoning? In other words, are there people that have a lot of copies in stock and they're manipulating prices, trying to get the prices up? That happens. We don't want to admit it, but it does happen.
Yeah.
The big thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm listening.
Oh, okay. And then one of the biggest problems that we look at, and that we have, is a movie gets announced, TV show gets announced, everybody just rushes to buy that whatever book is associated or tied in with it.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, it doesn't usually hold. The Batman movie with Michael Keaton did not influence prices on Batman comics. Superman movie, whether it was go back to the original TV show or you look at the movies in the 70s, did not influence the prices of Superman comics. But now, if they announce there's going to be a Smurf movie, then everybody's going to run out and buy the first copy of Smurf. Well, that's great. But why are you buying it? Are you buying it because you think you're going to become a millionaire overnight? A lot of times it's bad news for the last guy standing, which means the last guy that bought copies. Ask everybody that bought Walking Dead #1s 5 and 6 years ago that were 9.4s and 9.8s. Ask them what they're selling them for today. They're obviously going for they're going for nothing compared to what they sold for in the heyday. Older comics are usually, the prices go up for other reasons, usually rarity of the book. When you've got a book that, like a variant that comes out, or came out today, you may have hundreds of thousands of copies available versus a book that came out 50 years ago, 70 years ago, where there's only a few hundred known to exist. So from a collectability standpoint, usually, and there's going to be people going to totally argue with me on this, and that's fine. Usually, the older books have the best long-term investment because they're not dependent upon a movie or a TV show or some hype. Look at She-Hulk. Everybody went crazy over the She-Hulk comic when it got announced. She-Hulk series, I personally like it, but it's getting mixed reviews. So the comic price has gone down. You can find 9.8s on eBay for $600-$700. That same book was selling for over $1,000-$1,200 a few months ago. So it's been dependent upon the popularity. Look at Eternals #1. You want to buy any? I know plenty of people trying to sell them. And because they held on to them, expecting the movie would drive the price up. And it didn't. The movie didn't do as well as people expected. Price of the books went down. But you don't see that with certain golden age and majority of the golden age actually, and a lot of the silver age. You don't see that as much as you see it with newer books or hyped books or books that are predicated by, you know, whatever you want to call it, whether it's, you know, rumors or truth. But there are two different types of collectors, and a lot of times people don't like it when you say that, but there are two different ages of collectors. And the collectors that collect old stuff, they don't usually care anything about newer books. And they've seen this happen so many times over the years. And they've seen where books like that go down in price immediately after the hype is over with. Not sure if I answered your question the way you're looking, but you know, it is a part of our hobby that people need to look at. And I think if you're a collector, first and foremost, buy it because you enjoy it.
Yeah.
If it goes up in price, that's fantastic. If it doesn't go up in price, you're not upset because you bought what you enjoy.
Yeah.
But anybody that tells you they have a crystal ball, they don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No price guide has the crystal ball unless they're trying to invent it.
Yeah. No, I really love hearing what you're saying because I teach econ in high school level, and I mean we talk about supply and demand all the time. You know, it's driven by that, and it's like you can, as a seller, you can say I'm gonna sell this for $500 or whatever, but it takes every transaction has two parties in it, so you've got to have someone willing to pay for it. You know,
I was talking to a buddy of mine that ran a store years ago. This was about 10 years ago, actually, 10, 12 years ago. And there were some of his customers were friends of mine, and they were like, you know, we don't get it. Every time he gets in the variant covers or the alternate covers, he puts them on eBay. He doesn't put them in his store. And it kind of ticks us off because we have to go to eBay and buy them instead of buying them in a store. And I was like, makes sense, you know, that you'd be upset. And, you know, the way we used to look at things is if you got something in, you'd sell it in your store. And if it didn't sell within 30 days, you put it on eBay. And so I asked him, I was asking him one night and I said, you know, I don't get it. I said, you know, you got some of your customers upset by this. And he goes, Rick, let me explain something to you. And he woke me up real quick. He said, books come out tomorrow. If we don't sell them within the first 5 to 7 days, these variants, these alternate covers, next week there's 20 more. The next week there's 20 more. The next week there's 50 more. We have to sell it the minute it comes out because within a month there's so many more new ones. People, you know, it's lost its attention. The attention span has gone on to other things.
right?
So does that mean that book's worth buying because it's a collectible or because you enjoy it?
Right.
And that's the one thing that, like you said, supply and demand.
Yeah.
It's if there's 100 comics for sale, only 100, one book, and there are 100 people that want to buy it, but 70 of them want to buy it to resell. Who are they going to resell it to?
Yeah, 30. Yeah.
So, you know, that's what sometimes you have to look at.
Yeah.
And again, if somebody, you know, buys an expensive variant and they love it, they've done the greatest thing possible. And I mean that sincerely. You won the game.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy a book because it makes you happy, that's all that should matter.
Right.
But if you're buying it for investment,
we hear that with everybody in the business. Buy what you love. Buy what interests you. Don't worry about market price or anything like that. Just go with what makes you happy and what you enjoy.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, so we touched a little bit on Overstreet, and now you work with the comicpriceguide.com. So can you tell us,
Comics price.
can you tell us
There's an S.
oh, I'm sorry, comicspriceguide.com. And could you tell us what you do there and kind of what makes the company unique?
One, we are actually the first online comic book price guide or comics price guide. And Brian Neely is the CEO and is the creator of the company, and he started it back in 1995. One of the things, and of course now obviously there are several online price guides, but we utilize, there's so many different ways that you can get prices. Some people believe that you just get prices off the internet, that whether they're eBay, which GPA is mostly eBay or whatever, or you get it from auction houses. What about the people who do private sales? What about convention sales? What about some of the big mail order people? What about raw comics versus graded comics? You have to go after all of it. You have to get as much information as you can to be able to determine what a book sells for. That goes back to what I was saying earlier about you take one book, 5 different areas of the world, it's selling for 5 different prices. What's the reason? And then that's what you have to put together. So you need experience to be able to figure it out. I had somebody just a couple of weeks ago call me up and say that She-Hulk #1 9.8 sold for $2,300 at auction. And I was like, why? And he was like, well, do you think it's a good investment? And I said, have you been on eBay today? And he goes, no. I said, you might want to go. There were 2 copies at $599, 9/8 white pages. So what's the story?
Yeah.
So now what I do is I'm the marketing and promotions director for Comics Price Guy. I do a lot of the pricing. I mostly do the older stuff. But we're unique in the fact that we work on it every single day. We are not a printed price guide, which of course Overstreet was for so long. We literally are trying to get information from everybody as often as we can. We never turn down people who want to offer information. We do sometimes get people who offer information because, as I said earlier, they've got copies in stock and they're trying to get the price up. So you've got to be able to recognize that, and you got to research it. But we also, we literally work. When I say we work on the price guide every day, that's true. I've been up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, many a night, working on prices. But it's there's always room for improvement, and that's what we hope to do every day.
Well, yeah, I'm sure a lot of folks appreciate it, and I can't wait to start delving into it and checking it out for myself. And it's going to be helpful, I'm sure.
We actually have over 1 million real members.
Wow.
We have never in the history of our company ever set up somebody's account, whether it was real or fake. Every single account is a real person.
Wow.
If you were to ask me, hey, Rick, would you go set me up an account? I can't do it. You have to do it yourself. I just can't. Because we want to be able to look at you and be honest about it.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit, Rick, about your experience running a store. And rumor has it that you might have met Stan Lee a couple of times. Tell us about that. That's
a few
awesome.
times. We actually had Stan in our store a few times. The story back in those days we were the only stores in the 90s that he autographed in. But of course he did autograph in stores in the early years. And once he was in Spider-Man and started doing the MCU movies, his prices were far more expensive than I could have ever afforded back then. Stores were interesting because it was a great place to be able to get together with people that were like-minded. That, my first store was a college store. It was 500 square feet. And then, we grew to multiple stores with a store that was 7,000 square feet. And it used to be always just fun because the people that came in enjoyed the same thing you did. The one thing I loved about the stores was the customers. And, we picked up collections from all over the world and picked up a couple of very large collections actually here out of Tennessee. And by the way, Overstreet was in Cleveland, Tennessee. That's where he lived at the time. So I was home base out of Nashville. So he was only a 2-hour drive. But stores back then it seemed to be a lot different than they are now. And one of the things that, of course, happened were that people were led to believe that books were selling for these crazy prices, and people started buying them up. And then when a few years came along, these people started bringing the books back to their stores saying, hey, I need to sell these. Change of life circumstance happens to everybody. You graduate high school, graduate college, you get married, have a kid, need to buy a house, whatever. And they'd sell their collection. Well, these books that they were convinced from the early 90s on that were going to, put their kids through college and make them the new millionaires was a lie. And they found out the hard way that the store said, I got plenty of copies. I just don't need any more. And what nobody realized at that point was that those guys were still, or those people were also buying new books. And they stopped immediately. And that almost crushed our hobby. Our hobby went down to 10% of the amount of stores we had in 1990 within about 12 years. And that's one of the reasons why I guess I'm so down on anybody that's trying to predict or play the games on, this is going to be a hot book. Like I say, you don't want to be the last guy standing.
Yeah.
And it's happened too many times.
Wow.
But now as far as stores, Stan was hilarious. Stan and we paid him to come in. We never charged for his autograph. We just asked that you buy something in the store, and he would autograph it. And Stan would treat a 6-year-old kid as good as he would a billionaire. And that would be an exaggeration, but we did have a few millionaires come in the store, and he treated the kids just the same way. He was the greatest cheerleader this hobby will ever know. And there are people who, because of Jack Kirby and Stan, they don't like Stan, but I think we can't forget what he actually did for this hobby and tried to do up until, he died. But he was amazing, and he was hilarious to meet. And of course, we were always like, so what's Steve Ditko like? And he would say, oh, he's just Steve. He never heard him talk bad about anybody. But people that were private, he would never say a word about them. And I will tell you, he's fun to take to Hooters. We took him to his very first Hooters. Long story. We have pictures too. But, what we did was in our stores where we brought in whoever we could that were artists or writers. We also were the guys that brought in the Men Behind the Mask, the very first Star Wars group that started autographing around the world. And what we tried to do was introduce people to these guys or these icons that had helped create our childhood or brought us happiness or entertainment, however you want to look at it. We had a lot of artists that we were able to talk into doing. We had John Romita doing free head sketches. Those go for about $300 to $500 now. But it was amazing, and the people they fell in love with the artist and fell in love with us for bringing them. But it doesn't seem like that's as possible as it used to be, and that's why I say that these guys weren't movie stars back then. They weren't rock stars. They were to us, but to the world in general, they weren't.
Well, it's really cool hearing you say all that about Stan Lee. I remember when we had Shelton on, he was telling us how even when Stan Lee was getting older, he was still jumping out of his car. Like he'd pick him up at the airport, he still like jumped out. He was still enthusiastic. So that's really cool to hear.
Yeah.
We would literally when he would come in for a weekend, we would literally have to look at him and go, we might need to go to the hotel, because he would just keep going. I mean, he was like, the Energizer bunny. And now back in the 90s, he was in his 60s, but he also had some serious health scares in the 90s. And he never wanted a fan to leave upset or mad. Now, I saw Stan, in business situations where Stan was very, very serious. But when it came to fans, he was, like I said, I don't think there's anybody I've seen that's better. Now, I will tell you, John Romita Sal Buscema, some of those guys, they were fantastic with fans. And, you know, we had guys, like I said, we had guys that came in and did free head sketches. And we paid them, but they were willing to sit there until the last second. John Romita almost got bumped off a flight because he kept drawing. And we actually had the cops take him to the airport. So now this was back before 9/11, so you know obviously the security wasn't as tight, but they literally got him, drove up to the airport in a police car and let him out. So.
Wow.
I remember meeting his son, John Romita Jr. at Hero.
Oh yeah.
This past summer, and he was always praising his father, and he was just one of the most humble, you know, artists that you know I've met thus far. He was so awesome, just talking to me and you know, signing my stuff, and he was great.
I always tell people, if you ever get a chance to meet John Romita Jr., make sure you do, because he's super, super nice and he's very cordial. Then once you get finished meeting him and you realize, wow, that was a great experience, his father's 10 times that.
Wow.
He gets it from his father. I mean, but no, I mean, John Romita Jr. he's a really, really nice guy and he's great for the hobby. But it's amazing what his father, it seems like the older guys were always that way. You know,
Yeah.
I remember going to Atlanta Fantasy Fair. The Atlanta Fantasy Fair in the 70s in the 80s were the biggest convention in the country. And I remember being 18 years old, walking through there with this guy I did flea markets with, my partner. He's quite a bit older than me. And we were walking through, and there's this little guy standing there, and he was like, "Hey, hope you have a great show. Welcome in. Come on in. Have a great show." And he's saying this to everybody. And we walked past him. I looked over at my buddy. I said, "Who's that?" And he goes, "That's Jack Kirby." You know, I mean, back then it meant nothing.
Wow.
I mean, it did, but it didn't. In other words, you could go up and talk to him, spend time with him, and he wouldn't have thought, you know, anything.
Mm.
But now it seems like you go to conventions and you wait in line for hours to get to meet somebody for about 3 or 4 minutes, and that's about it. It's kind of sad.
It's definitely changed. I remember being able to go to conventions in my hometown of Portland and be able to talk to the artists and have them draw stuff for you, and it wouldn't cost but $20. You know, this was in the late 80s, early 90s. They would talk to you forever and draw whatever you could think of, and they would do it for $20. And it
Oh yeah,
that won't happen anymore.
We had guys do autograph sessions for us and all over the years. I remember Kevin Eastman, when he came to Nashville and did some stuff for us, he was charging $20 for all 4 turtles.
Wow.
Think about that today. Good luck.
Oh,
Not necessarily that he's charging more, but that people are willing to pay a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at that time, turtles hadn't become a cartoon. But those days, unfortunately, seem to be long gone. There are still, you know, some great guys out there to meet. The older guys, unfortunately, you know, you look at John Romita, his health has been bad. We don't get to meet a lot of the older guys much anymore. The ones that are still around, for whether it's their health reason or family health reasons. And that's kind of sad.
yeah.
Don't know if there's a solution to it. I wish somebody would really, and they've tried it a couple of times over the years. I wish somebody would go to some of the older guys and just do interviews and let them talk as long as they want to talk.
Mm-hmm.
Could you imagine the stories? You know, every time I went to dinner with Neil Adams, the big joke was I never ate dinner, because he'd start telling these stories, and he would tell stories that nobody probably knew any more about or knew more about than he did. I thought Overstreet knew about the history of this hobby. Neil Adams was like a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah, I bet.
And he would start telling stories, and everybody at the table would just be like, I never knew about this. And then all of a sudden, you know, you've been there for 2 hours and the restaurant's looking at you like, you want to pay your bill and go? And we're like, can we get a doggy back, please? You know, and some of the older guys, I'm not saying that they're better than the newer artists. It's just the experiences that I've had with the older artists and writers have usually been that way.
Yeah,
Um,
we had speaking of newer sort of artists, we had Aaron LoPresti on our show, and he was so great. I mean, he is like a younger version of what you're talking about with
Right.
Neil Adams. He would just go and just tell stories that were just so fascinating to learn about, about his experiences in getting into the industry, and it was just great. It's like you said, your food would get cold if you were at a restaurant.
And we
These
just want
guys
to
It
hit
love to
happened to
record.
talk,
us a
and
lot
it's
of
awesome.
times,
Yeah. We're just
but
like
it was,
tempted to just hit record and be like, go,
Yeah.
I remember one time, the first time we brought Jim Shooter in, and we were trying to figure out something different to do. And he had just he was just in the ending of his career with Valiant when those guys took over. And some of our customers, we were talking to someone saying, we got Jim Shooter coming in. And what he did was he was coming in doing this seminar on how to get into comic books. Well, he's one of the best editors there ever was. So who better to talk to than a guy that would be the guy that would hire you. And what our customers are like, I'd just like to go to dinner with him. I'd just like to sit down and talk to him. And we'd already done that with Stan and a few other people, and we it didn't hit us. Every one of these guys has got a story to tell, and majority of their stories are different than the other guy. But if you like the hobby, if you like comics, if you like some of the stuff that this particular individual's worked on, you're probably going to like the stories they got to tell. And so that always became a big thing. We would give away dinners, we'd do a drawing or a charity thing, and you get to go to dinner with whoever it was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
cool.
that's really been one of the joys of us doing this show. This is our 17th one, and it's just like, we've talked to different store owners, different con organizers, and people from different walks of life. And sure, some of them have similar stories, but they're all different, really. And so it's fun just to sit back and listen and hear what everyone has to say.
Sure, it is, and unfortunately, we're losing so many of them every day that we're going to lose some of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish, like everything, every time I'd gone to dinner with Stan or Neil, I'd have recorded them.
Yeah.
But you don't think about that now. You don't think about it back then.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's
so
really
there's some
cool
great.
too. Is we have you, and it'll be out there for eternity with the whole YouTube. It'll be there for everybody to come in and listen to what you've had to say, which is just the same as listening to anybody that's done art or been in the comic business. Is just great to hear these stories, from your perspective. So we super appreciate you coming on and spending
No,
time with us.
I appreciate the fact that y'all would invite me. I mean, it's an honor to be invited, and I'm long-winded, as you already know.
But
But
that's what we're about. We're all about wanting to hear more. We want to hear these
my
stories, and it's great.
my better half is about 6 feet away, and she's laughing. So at me being saying I'm long-winded. But the one thing that I always think back about what Jim Shooter said that time about riding in on the train and people looking at him like he was an overgrown child, a guy in a suit reading comic books. What the heck is this all about? Not knowing that he was editing the book on the train. But it's so cool to see what we love, or my age group, and certainly y'all probably see it as well, is that the stuff that we grew up with, that entertained us, that made us happy, whatever, is now more part of everyday life than probably anything else you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Look at all the big movies that are comic book related, TV shows that are comic book related. Nobody, if somebody would have told you in 1970s, 1980s, even the early 90s, that, 5 or 6 of the top 10 movies would be comic book related, they just look at you like you're an idiot.
Yeah.
Think Michael Keaton and Tobey Maguire, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thinking about that, what would be your advice for a collector or anyone who's who's trying to get into this hobby?
I think the best advice anybody can give a new collector or an old collector is collect what you enjoy. Find something that you enjoy. Find the person that you can trust when you buy from them. You know, customers would come into our stores and they would buy certain books and spend a certain amount of money. And we would know. I mean, we had people that were asking for certain books, so we'd carry them. But we never considered them investment books.
Mm-hmm.
So customers would come in and say, you know, I want to buy that book. Those two books can be $200-300, which was a lot of money for comics in the 90s. And the first question we would ask is, are you buying it because you want it, because you enjoy it, or are you buying it because you want to invest in it? And if you're investing, you know, then make sure that the guy you're buying from or whoever you're buying from has got the same idea in mind. Because most, you know, you've had Shelton Drum, which I have so much respect for Shelton. People like that will never deliberately do you wrong because they want to see you in 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I'm not demeaning any dealer. I'm just saying that as a collector, there are plenty of people out here who will take care of you, who will help you, who will give you advice. But if you're going to do anything, start off with what you enjoy first. Then if you decide you want to get into the investment part of it, that's great. Take your time, get advice from people that have no ulterior motive, and then start looking at some of the past history. We used to always tell people, if you're going to buy a book for investment, look at what its past looks like. What's its track, you know, its track history. And why would you buy a book that went up in price 5 days ago, but 2 months ago or 3 years ago, nobody gave a crap about it? It was sitting in quarter boxes. What caused that book to go up in price?
Right.
So,
Hype.
but for, oh, I'm sorry.
Hype would be the answer to that question. What caused that book to go up? It would be hype. You know, like you were talking about the She-Hulk book. Nobody cared
She-Hulk book.
a year
If
ago,
you
2
if you
years
go
ago.
back, if you go back to most comic book stores, when the She-Hulk books came out, they'll tell you that majority of the time they ended up in quarter and 50-cent boxes. When John Byrne did the She-Hulk series, yes, it was popular because usually whatever John Byrne would touch back then would get hot. But, you know, but then again, take a look at Night Nurse, 4-issue book, 4-issue series. Got hot, a little hot because of the Netflix, all the Netflix stuff with Linda Carter. But it was already hot because of the fact that Night Nurse was not a big selling book when it came out. So they ended up in quarter boxes. So there weren't many printed. By the time the 4th issue came out, the book was already being canceled. It was a low print run, but those books always ended up in quarter boxes. Go find a near mint copy today. That's an investment because you can't find one. There are very few of them out there. And it's because of the fact that nobody gave a crap about that book at the beginning. But that book was already hot before the Netflix series started. But that's just one tiny little example.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah.
You know, I remember when I remember writing this article about this All-Star issue, and several people were like, yeah, you're pushing it too hard. And I was like, I'm telling you, this book's going to be crazy. And a lot of other people agreed with me. It was All-Star number 8, first appearance of Wonder Woman and Origin. 1990, 91 in fine condition, that was about a $400, $500 book. Find one for under 50 to 60,000 today.
Wow.
By the way, the Wonder Woman movie had nothing whatsoever to do with that book going up in price. It went up long ago. But, you know, there are so many good books out there. And I think one of the things that hurts us is that cover prices are so high. And if you know, kids look at it like, I can go buy video games for a lot cheaper than I can buy brand new comics.
Yeah.
And that hurts us.
Yeah.
But, you know, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm just nodding in agreement. I mean, shoot, you know, get my subscriptions for the month, it's like over $100 every month. And, you know, I've got a salary job, so I can take it, but I mean, start worry sometimes with some of the kids that want to get into comics. I'm like, your allowance or whatever your part-time job is, like that's a decent chunk of change.
When video games started becoming so big in the early 90s, we just kept seeing our age group of customers, the younger age group was starting to vanish.
Mhm.
Because you'd say here's you want to go in and buy a brand new video game for 30 or 40 bucks. Now you tell them, well, you can go in and buy 5 comic books for 25 or 30 bucks.
Yeah.
And they're going to go for the video game.
Mm-hmm.
And that also is a great thing for older books, Silver Age and Gold. Well, not Golden Age, but you can find Bronze and Silver Age good reader books for $4 or $5. And there's some great stuff out there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, buy it because you like it, not because somebody tells you it's a great thing. Buy it because you like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Rick, this has been an absolute joy, and I mean, I know from when we talked in the past, I mean, just scheduling this, and we talked for over an hour. Even one time I was calling you just like talk about scheduling, and we ended up talking like for 45 minutes. And I mean,
Sorry.
no, I loved it. I loved every single time. So I mean, just know you have a standing invitation if you ever want to come on, because I'm sure there's more we can talk about. This has been awesome. It's so cool hearing your story, and this theme has come up in this interview before, but this just talking and having this down, and we love listening. So thank you so much, not just for coming on here, but just all that you've done for the comic book hobby and industry in your years. We really appreciate it.
Mhm.
Well, I really do appreciate your invitation. You guys are great, and I appreciate it. It's an honor to be on your show tonight. And I interrupted you. I think I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Yeah,
Oh.
absolutely.
Isn't it great that we're not looked at as the weirdos we were? Well, at least in my age group, when we were 10, 12 years old buying comic. She's laughing at me.
No, I was a weirdo in high school.
I was a weirdo in high school, but I was also the guy that was the rock star, as it were, playing in bands
cool.
and stuff. And so that I had both worlds going for me in the negative.
It's a different world now, and it's in so many other reasons. But as far as comic books, it's great to see so many people enjoy the same thing. It's almost like when you go to a convention now, it's like family. You walk in and you realize you're in a group of 10, 20, 30, 50,000 people that are just like you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so cool.
Yeah. We're involved in a cool hobby. I can, if we can end on a high note, just know as a high school teacher, I can talk to 15, 14-year-olds, love talking about it. They love asking me who my favorite superhero is. They know who Thanos is, which if you ask people 20 years ago who Thanos was, it's like, it's so cool. The love that the comic book hobby has received in recent years. And
yeah, it really is. And I hope it doesn't slow down, doesn't stop.
Yeah.
So,
well, thanks again. We really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you having me on. I really do. It was great. It was a lot of fun, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Good night, guys. Thank you.
Night.
Take care.
Yay! Come